All right, good afternoon, everybody. We are nearing the end of Hispanic Heritage Month, the time where we recognize the generations of Latinx, Hispanic Americans who have, through their sacrifices, enriched and elevated the visibility of Latinx people and their contributions. For many of us living in the Southwest United States, our history is rich and filled with countless stories of sacrifice and resilience made by our ancestors. In 2020, the US population grew to more than 62 million people, the fastest growing population in the US. But Hispanic, Latinx, Chicano Americans, those communities are not a monolith. Our identities reflect many cultures, countries, and languages, despite attempts, both past and present, to reduce this diversity into a single word or a single thing. And what does it mean to be Hispanic? What is even Hispanic Heritage Month, and what are we celebrating, and what does it mean to have pride in that heritage? On today's episode, we're going to continue our journey towards a better understanding of our own identities. Through this process and within today's conversation, it's my hope that we're able to honor that history, those ancestors, as well as our own experiences of being Latino. Welcome to Sepas. Today is Thursday, October 7th. My name is Danny Hernandez. Thank you for joining us. At All in Education, our Latinx staff sees this talk as very personal. Most of us are first-generation Americans, the sons and daughters of raceros and at various places on our journeys to further understand our own racial identities. When it comes to heritage and pride, the Formworker Movement, Mexican traditions, culture, and communities are at the forefront of our minds. So for today's conversation, we are going to focus on themes related to celebrating our heritage as it relates to Mexican American history, movements, demographics, and identity, both past and present, featuring some incredible Latinx rock stars. And without further ado, I will go ahead and introduce today's panelists. First, we have Norma Flores Lopez, the Chief Programs Officer for Justice for Migrant Women. Norma?
Hi, everyone. As mentioned, my name is Norma Flores Lopez. I am currently living outside Washington, D.C. area, but I'm originally a Tejana. I grew up in the Rio Grande Valley. I am the daughter of Mexican Americans. My parents were born in the U.S., but they were raised in Mexico back when the border was a little bit more forgiving, I will say, and my parents could be able to cross back and forth. They came from agricultural families. That is something that they came into the U.S. to go work in the field, and something that they took me and my sisters along on the journey. So my formative years were spent in packing up our bags, loading up into the back of a pickup truck and starting a 2-day journey every year up to the northern states to pick everything from apples, detasseling corn, harvesting asparagus, onions. We traveled from states from Indiana to Michigan to Colorado and Iowa. And that was the only experiences that I knew. It was something that I saw my grandparents doing, my parents doing, and something me and my sisters did up until I was able to graduate from high school and started going into college. And so I grew up working in the fields too, alongside my parents, and having to go and work long hours in extreme conditions, doing back-breaking work, all to be able to help put food on the table. And that's the great irony. That was the reality of my parents and of my grandparents, and of me today, and of kids that work out in the fields today. The approximately 500,000 children that continue to work in the fields, is that those are the very families that are not able to afford the very fruits and vegetables that they're harvesting. So I have now dedicated myself to a career in advocating for these farm worker families like myself. And I'm very proud of the work that I get to do now at Justice for Migrant Women, where we advocate for the civil and human rights of women, of migrant women, whether they're crossing international borders, state borders, counties, anything in search of work to be able to keep themselves and their families fed and safe. And so really excited to be able to be here and explore a little bit more about some of those roots.
Norma, thank you so much. I met Norma when I moved to DC over a decade ago, within my first year, and I continue to be so it's incredible to hear Norma's story and the work that she continues to do on behalf of our community. So Norma, thank you for being here. Dr. Rogelio Saenz.
Yeah, good afternoon, buenas tardes, and thank you, Danny, for the invitation. And Danny and I are connected in Texas A&M University when he was a student, and he took my sociology of Mexican Americans class 2006, I think you mentioned, or somewhere in that.
Yeah, it's been a while.
Yeah, and then I have the connection with with my esteemed colleague Norma, also from the Valley. I'm also from the Valley, from the little town of Mercedes, right in the middle of the Valley. So to me, that even though I left the Valley in 1981 when I graduated from Pan American University and left, the Valley has always been in my heart, in mi corazón, and in many respects, the Valley area has always been one of the poorest areas economically in terms of poverty and so forth, but it's been one of the richest regions as well in terms of us that grew up in the Valley. It was a place where we learned and appreciated to be bilingual and bicultural, and we lived in a setting that was really either we were from both parts of the border area. It was very easy to cross, as Norma had mentioned before 9/11, and in many respects, people on the border region, on both sides of the border, both sides of the river, were much more alike to each other than we were in the Valley, for example, compared to people in the Panhandle in Austin, Houston, and then people in the border region as well were more similar to us than they were to Chilangos and so forth, of people in Mexico City. So that was the area that again, the passion for finding the inequality, the racism that existed, that we were 95% of the population, but in many of the communities around the Valley, whites were the power structure. They were the bankers. They were the principals in elementary school in Mercedes. Danny, like as you mentioned with me, it was not until sixth grade that I had my first Mexican American teacher. So it was a very Mexicano environment, Chicano environment, but at the same time, very much where there was the pressure to squash in many respects our language and our culture. I still remember going to elementary school and people would be punished for speaking Spanish if they were caught and so forth. It was very much of a cultural shaming, and people would hide their tacos, for example, in una esquina, that you would be laughed at and things like that. Now, ironically, the tacos are and the Mexican food is some of the most popular foods here in the country. And then from Pan American, and then I went to Iowa State University in the middle of nowhere that I didn't even know, because I had only left the Valley about 3 times in my life before I went to graduate school. And then I finished in 1986, and then went to Texas A&M University, and I was there for 25 years in the sociology department, and then moved here to San Antonio in 2011, and I was recruited to be the Dean of the College of Public Policy, and I did that for 7.5 years, and now I'm a professor in the Department of Demography. And like Norma also mentioned, the passion that I have is for getting the word out in terms of the true facts regarding the Latino population in the midst of so much lies and stereotypes about the Latino population, and also calling attention to the major issues that impact us, both through academic writing as well as through op-eds, research briefs, and things like that.
Well, thank you, Dr. Saenz. And like Dr. Saenz mentioned, he was my first Latino educator. And I grew up in Texas too, and coming from a small town on the North Texas is just such the vast difference of my experience, and what it meant for me then and what it means for me now. And so it was important for you to be here for this conversation, Dr. Saenz, and I'm so honored that you accepted our invitation. So thank you both, and welcome. So to jump into our conversation, I do want to kind of just transition from based on something that Dr. Saenz said, this cultural shaming. I know both of you kind of touched a little bit about your early experiences, but Norma, do you mind talking a little bit about your education, especially growing up in the Valley?
Well, as mentioned, I grew up in South Texas in the Valley, where it was significantly a lot of Latinos, but my education would actually start in the northern states in Indiana. And so in this little town in the Midwest, I would be the only Latinx, the only Hispanic, the only Spanish speaking family in the community. And every year we would keep coming back, go into that community. I would start school there. I remember my earliest memories of being in the classroom was staring at a white teacher, and she's staring right back at me because we didn't know how to talk to each other. I spoke Spanish at home. That's what my parents grew up speaking. They didn't learn the English language because, again, being in the Rio Grande Valley, they had access to everything and could continue to speak only Spanish. And then when we would go up north as a farm worker community, we did all of our communication through contractors. We never really had to speak any of the English language. And like any good first generation Latina, anytime that they needed to talk to the outside world, once we learned English, they leaned on us kids to sort of push us forward and say, hey, go and talk to this mechanic at the garage and negotiate prices on different car parts. I mean, it was just really throwing us out into these sort of scenarios to help with survival. And if before it was me, it was my older sister, it was a cousin, or it was whoever, to be able to help our families bridge that gap. But in school, I had to learn how to be my own advocate. I had to learn how to adapt very quickly. I learned the English language as quickly as I could so I could be able to communicate with those people. I mean, talk about immersion. I was thrown in there. And once I would come back down to Texas, would start a totally different battle as a migrant farm worker, where I would have to come in 3 months late and have 3 months worth of work to be able to catch up on and to do, and having to, advocate once again for myself, of trying to be able to let folks know, like, I don't need these remedial classes. For example, I had already started learning how to speak English. I didn't need to be put into remedial classes every single year when I would come back. And so mine was a little bit of a different journey, in that as a migrant farm worker, there was still those complications. And I mean, the majority of farm workers are of Latinx descent. Majority are Mexican American and Spanish speakers. And so what I went through, so many kids had to go through back then, continue to go through now. And it's no surprise why the national dropout rate for farm worker youth is 4 times the national average, because they have all of these sort of barriers. But when you don't recognize those challenges that impact the Latinx community, when you're not putting any resources into that, when there's not systems put in place to be able to help these kids navigate the schools, especially when their parents maybe didn't go to school the way my parents had to drop out in the 3rd grade and in the 6th grade, they weren't much help and they couldn't really advocate. And in our communities, the teachers knows best. And so they weren't in a position to be able to push back and to be able to say, well, maybe my daughter doesn't need to be in these remedial classes. I would be coming in late and then having to stay later and having to stay more behind, and then going back up north to schools too, because my parents tried to keep us enrolled every time that we would move anywhere, keep us in school, keep emphasizing the importance of school. And in doing so, having to go into another school, a totally different state system, different classes, and trying to keep up with everybody, and being the only non-white child in many of these Midwest classrooms. I had a lot of uncomfortable interactions with some folks, kids pointing out my food, pointing out my language, wanting me to be their personal translators. I had teachers that had problems with that. If I was in the classroom with a cousin of mine, for example, and we spoke Spanish to each other, would be threatened to be sent to the principal's office, because as I got told over and over again growing up, how do I know you're not speaking about me? Even though I was simply saying, hey, do you have an extra pencil? Or, hey, have you talked to our family, our grandma or whatever? And it would be very basic things like that. We even would get policed into like the school buses, where in the school bus, which had nothing to do with school, is after school, we'd be sitting with our siblings speaking in Spanish. Our language was comfortable to us. And once again, we'd be told, don't speak Spanish, because how do I know that you're not talking about us? And that would be the bus driver. And I'd be like, because we have better things to talk about. But now we will. But it's that sort of, those sort of uncomfortable interactions that made me curious about who I was as a person and what were those things that made me different from them. And, as a kid, you want to blend in, you want to be like them. You don't really appreciate at that point, what makes us different is what makes us wonderful, and to celebrate those aspects. And especially because there wasn't a whole lot of representation in the classroom, or there wasn't a whole lot of representation in the textbooks. So you felt like an outsider and you wanted to just belong. You just wanted to feel like you were somewhere where you could be seen as who you are as a person and not automatically judged because your skin color is a certain way or you have a certain accent or your name they butcher because they are trying really hard to pronounce it how they think it needs to be pronounced. And so growing up, like I said, through the school system, it became very obvious to me how much it was needed for so many kids that were going through that journey of exploring who they are as an individual. It was important to also be able to have that be included as part of the lessons about some of those roots and those traditions and those pieces of our history that were erased out of these textbooks, because representation does matter. You're seeing yourself reflected in some of these wonderful leaders that made all these great contributions does do something to you about how you feel about yourself and who you are as a person. And like I said, I had my own individual things that made me different, knowing that I had to go work in the fields and other classmates didn't. They had a summer vacation to relax. And meanwhile, I was out there picking onions or detasseling corn, getting sunburn, walking into spider webs, having to, bring our own water or go to the bathroom in old porta potties and shared migrant housing. Those were things, aspects of my life that, made me a strong person, but it made it hard to be able to connect and relate to other people. And so it definitely made it a struggle, especially at school, which is sort of like the center and the hub, that I think it would have been wonderful if I had much more support. And it's wonderful to see things evolving now that there are schools that now have clubs that celebrate, and you see months like Hispanic Heritage Month that are being put as part of the programming. But that wasn't necessarily the what I would see in my reality growing up. And I just know how important that is for those kids that are learning about who they are in that journey.
No, for sure, for sure. Dr. Saenz, I wanted to hear your thoughts especially around some of the messages that you heard as a kid. I know that there's some that we've touched on. How did those? What were those messages, and how did they impact you?
I think in terms of the messages from within our own family, within our own community, I think that there was always a lot of support. I think that one of the things that was also the challenge was because our parents or our grandparents, with our grandparents, we're talking about persons who had 3 years at most of education. In the case of my parents, my mother had an 8th grade education. So there was little in terms of the knowledge of college and university and things like that. So, and I sometimes I get upset when people say, "Oh, Hispanics or Latinos, parents don't care about their education of their kids," because right now, just like in generations past, there has been that very strong desire for success, and people seeing education as the vehicle to get you out of poverty and make contributions and so forth. So to me, it was a very supportive kind of environment. I think that in certain respects, even though there was that appreciation and desire for advancing in education, unfortunately, for many kids in our generation, as well as in other generations, there was a push out. People were being pushed out of school because they were seen as alien or so forth, that they didn't belong, and they never did get that message across. And that degree of diversity that exists within our own communities is not appreciated. And I think that there was a tremendous loss of skills of what people could have become if they would have had much more supportive kinds of educational environments.
And I think of what Norma said, Norma said that the trust of teachers to a fault at times, right? And what that does when it's not a collaborative or partnership with families involved, but the same way with the schools. But Dr. Saenz, you became you kept going to school for a long time to become a PhD. Through that experience, what was it different when you left Texas?
Yeah, it was very different because again, we're very poor. So I grew up very, very poor. And to give you the illustration, then when I had gone to, and fortunately, it was a different time. And the cost of an education, even though it was a tremendous amount of money, it is nothing compared to what the cost is right now. I think I remember paying at Pan American University for about 15 hours, 12, 15 hours, something like $300 for a semester to enroll and things like that. And there was also that, I remember that was the time. And so I grew up mostly in the 1960s and in the 1970s. I graduated from high school in 1976. And about that time, 1975, I think it was, in the winter of 75, University of Texas, Austin sent a VTC or a Greyhound up and down the valley to pick up kids and bring them to Austin to see the university. They were trying to diversify, whatever. And then so in Mercedes, man, we all hopped in. Man, we were about 30 of us that went. It was like a free trip. That was the third trip out of the valley when I left for Iowa to Austin. And it was like a totally different environment. I had never seen anything like that. And then we were given information about the applying there, what you needed to do, the dorms and things like that. And I'm thinking, we don't have money for dorms or apartments or anything like that. So that was one of those. But it was kind of a little bit of a vision about what's possible. But when I graduated from Pan American, that was in 1981, and then I had applied for graduate school, and I had missed most of the deadlines. But one of the ones that was still available was Iowa State University, and that's how come I said I didn't even know where it was. And one of the nice things is that Iowa State, I was to find out, did not look at GRE scores, because my GRE scores were horrendously bad. And then they had offered me an assistantship also. So I was doing work in the Iowa Census Services, which I already had an interest in demography. And so that really solidified it. But the way that I had finished at Pan American, and at that time, the unemployment rates in the Valley, this was the big recession that took place in the 1980s, early 1980s. Unemployment rates were about 20% or so in the Valley. Interest rates were about 18-20%. My mother, we didn't own a house. We lived with an aunt in their house, so there was no collateral or anything like that. And my poor mother, bless her heart, she went to the bank to try to get a loan to help me get money to be able to go to Iowa, because I hadn't been able to get a job that summer. And of course, it was denied. Fortunately, my brother was working at a Triple H, one of the little stores there in the Valley, a convenience store, and then he gave me $125. And then I had the fortune where a friend of mine from the city of Dona, then he asked me, Rogelio, what are you going to do now? You graduated. I said, well, I got accepted at Iowa State, but I don't have a way of getting there. And then he told me, well, I have a friend who goes either to that university or the other one, and maybe I'll talk to him. Maybe he can give you a ride there. And he talked to him, and the person contacted me. Bert was his name, Joe Colunga, the other person. And then Bert contacted me and said, I go to University of Iowa. He said, but if you want to, I can give you a ride. So then he did pick me up, and then we stopped in Austin. He had a friend there. We slept there. The next day, it was a Saturday morning, and then headed to Ames, Iowa, which I had I thought it was close to New York or someplace in that area. And then I got there like at 8:15 or so. He dropped me off at the student union, and I had this beat up suitcase. And I was thinking, okay, now what am I going to do? Because I didn't have a place to stay or anything. And then so I was at the student union, and then some person walks over to me, a white man, and then he says, can I help you? And I said, well, I'm looking for a very cheap place to stay. And he said, well, do you mind religion? And I said, right now, I don't mind religion. So he said, follow me. And this total stranger. So I'm following this guy. And then he takes me over to his car. And then I get in, and then he drives me to, it was a Loaves and Fishes. It was a homeless shelter that he knew the director there. and he talked to her, and then I was able to stay there about 4 or 5 nights until I was able to get a loan. But it was that experience in terms of kind of I could have easily turned back or used probably that $125 to come back or not gone. But it was that when talking to students and they say, I don't know if I can make it. And I tell them that story. And it's one of those where it's kind of for students, it's an inspirational kind of story because some are saying, well, maybe I don't have it at that too bad getting there. So that's that keeps me also going in terms of trying to open doors and provide opportunities for others along the way.
No, for sure. And I compared it to my getting to college story, and it does not compare anymore. So no, thank you for sharing that story. And so to pivot a tiny bit, when we talk, when both of you, this is a question for both of you, talk about your racial identity, what words do you use? What words come to mind, and why? And so whoever would like to start.
Start. So for me, I identify as Latina. I think that, as I mentioned, discovering who we are is a journey. And so it also depends on the context on how or why. Growing up, as I mentioned, being othered quite a bit, especially when we would go up north and we were othered as farm workers, as migrants, as outsiders. We did as much as we could to unify us and to be able to feel like we were all together. That was our only community. And so whether folks who were working in the fields along us were US born, Mexico born, Central America, we just saw ourselves as Latinos out there in the community. And you know, as you'll learn if you look at the history on how this evolves, language evolves. And so as we're learning more about who we are and what we are, these different labels that get used on us have different contexts and different meanings and different reasons why. I got called a lot of things growing up along the way. But at the end of the day, I think that what really matters here is how I choose to identify myself, because the labels really are for me and not what other people use it for. You know, originally with Hispanic, that was something that was developed with census and you know, being able to band together as a community so that we could be able to ask for resources. And in that particular context, I also feel like I'm a Hispanic, but I identify more as a Mexican American, you know, being able to bring in those roots, especially coming from Texas. I feel just as Tejana as I do Mexican American. I love being able to be Latinx and being able to be much more inclusive, because again, it goes back to the evolution and understanding that, you know, that by using Latina or Latino, you leave out a whole lot of people. And what makes us wonderful is all of those different pieces of diversity. And so I try, as I educate myself, to be able to use terms that make me feel like I'm a part of something bigger and that I'm inclusive and welcoming people under this big, wonderful tent of mine. And
myself, I grew up identifying as Mexicano or Mexican. And it was even though I was a probably third, fourth generation or so forth, my grandfather was born in the city of Hidalgo, right across from Reynosa. And most of my family, it was one of those, I think, where the border had crossed us. And then grandmother had come during the Mexican Revolution and so forth. But it was because we spoke Spanish in the home, and we considered ourselves Mexicanos. That was the identity that I grew up with. The Americanos were the white people as well as African Americans. There was kind of the English represented kind of the Americanos. Nonetheless, the people, and it happens, I think that was a part of the introduction, Danny, I think that you made, that even though that we were born here, and if we consider ourselves Mexicanos, people in Mexico, for example, or people who are first generation that were born in Mexico, they say you're not Mexicano, you're Americano, you grew up, and that's always one of the things that. But I think that very much in what people feel in their hearts and in their spirit, that's really the identity. I think in terms of, as Norma mentioned, the Hispanic came out during the 1970s and particularly the 1980 census. There was a lot of distancing, I think, in the more progressive parts of the Latino community at that time. And I think that the term Latino and Latina became much more acceptable. And then so I've considered myself also Latino in that kind of a broader umbrella term. But again, in terms of the roots, again, the Mexicano identity.
Both of the pieces there, I think, Norma, the way you describe Latinx, I think are the words I've been looking for to describe it. And I think, the Hispanic piece as well. Dr. Saenz, in terms of Hispanic, do you mind talking a little more about that history? I know Norma mentioned it from the census, and then you said some of the division. Do you mind talking a little bit more about the history and background about the word Hispanic, just for a second?
Yeah, so this was from the 1970 and the 1980 census. The Office of Management and Budget is the agency, the federal agency that establishes the categories that will be used for the census, as well as for all this other business in terms of federal kind of I don't know, I can't find the word right now, but where we're identified under those particular categories. So that was at the time then that Hispanic was created. This was something that was imposed on the community. The community really did not have any say in terms of what we would be called. Before those censuses, we were, depending on where we lived in the country, we were either Spanish surname individuals or Spanish language individuals, depending on part of the country. And then I think that one of the things that didn't make the term Hispanic acceptable is that it very much emphasized the Hispanic Spanish roots as opposed to the indigenous roots of Latin America, the Caribbean, and other parts of the world that we came from. So that there was a lot of the push to try to change that. And by the time I think that you're talking about by 1990 or so, you begin seeing Latino became much more of an acceptable term. I think Texas was one of the states that continued to use Hispanic much more so, as well as New Mexico was the other state. So that has been kind of the history of that. Incidentally, in the 1930 census, the term Mexican became a racial category. So it was a racial category. I think that had to do the time that we're talking about. The Border Patrol had been established in 1924. In that period, you had the Great Depression. You had the deportations that were taking place. The repatriation program that saw about a third of the Mexicano population in the United States deported to Mexico during the Depression, native born as well as people who were born in Mexico. And interestingly, I think we've seen a very major change as a result of the 2020 census. That we've seen a tremendous change in the way that Latinas have been identifying themselves with respect to racial identification. The Census Bureau, in many ways, had pushed Latinos to become white, even when a large portion classified themselves as other. There was the ways questions were asked and so forth to try to get people to commit other than the other category. But interestingly, with the 2020 census, what we saw was about a 58% decline of persons who classified themselves as white. And there was a major increase in individuals that classified themselves some other race that they identified, as well as the multiracial, and even the indigenous, the native, the American Indian and Alaska Native racial category. You saw a significant increase. That has always been a problematic racial category in the census because it has been very US based as opposed to the broader indigenous roots in Latin America and the Caribbean. But you've seen this roots. And I suspect that diversity was always there, but the Census Bureau had used more narrow kind of processing of the data that didn't allow those to come out. So that represents a very interesting kind of trend.
Thank you for that background. Norma, for talking a little more, so now to Hispanic heritage. Earlier you had mentioned that it's something that you're seeing more, that schools are just celebrating that more than as compared to your upbringing. What does it mean to you now, and do you have any advice for how to celebrate or elements to make sure that we include?
I really enjoy months like Hispanic Heritage Month because, or Latinx Month, or however we want to call it, as we've been talking about how it's been evolving. But to me, it gives us an opportunity to be able to sort of pause and really appreciate some of those contributions of great leaders that we have, of our communities that have Latinx roots, and what they do to be able to keep our country going. I think that has been especially apparent and highlighted throughout this COVID pandemic, that it's those folks that are in the front line are predominantly made of people of color, especially those from Hispanic, Latinx roots. We're the ones that are out there working to make sure that we have food on the table, that our services are going, that our society can keep going, risking their lives, risking their well-being, their health, and that of their families, to be able to make sure that all of us can continue to live our regular lives as much as possible and keep the economy going. So it definitely helps to be able to take a pause and to be reminded to look around and see all the wonderful things that our community does, and how we are very much a part of the fabric of this country. Because as much as I identify as Latinx, as all of these other names, Chicana, Mexican American, all of those wonderful names, I also identify as American. I was US born. My parents are US born. My grandparents are naturalized. My husband served in the military. We are as American as they come, and that's what makes us wonderful, is that we can be both. We don't have to choose one or the other. We can be all of these things. And so to be able to see that now being put into the classrooms, of students being asked to be able to talk about their roots, to be able to see much more diversity in those that are leading in the classrooms, those that are leading around our communities. We have Sonia Sotomayor at the Supreme Court. We have our living legend, Dolores Huerta, who's out there still showing the way on how to be able to organize and lift people's voices. It's beautiful to see much more representation in entertainment, because that means something, to be able to see our stories being told by our voices in our way. That's how we're going to be able to break down a lot of these stereotypes, a lot of these barriers that are being built that keep us from being able to fulfill our full potential. And so if in our generations we've been able to break down so many barriers and do these wonderful things, I can only imagine what's going to happen with the next generations as we continue to encourage them to learn more about who they are, to celebrate, to be proud of who they are, to be able to reach for the stars, and to be able to be anything and everything, as we've been able to see now in some of these highest offices, but while still being able to also appreciate all of those folks that are leaders in their homes, that are leaders in their societies, in the workplaces. I just really think it's a wonderful opportunity for us to be able to celebrate the same way that folks celebrate African American History Month, the same way you could also celebrate, Pride Month, the same way you could celebrate Women's History Month. We could celebrate all of it, and every aspect of our life should be celebrated today and every day.
No, thank you, Norma. I think for me, there's so much of my own identity that I'm still learning, and a lot of that, I do tie it to the Formworker Movement. I think that I struggle with how to tell those stories, how to honor those stories, and how to especially lift up the values that are still true and still something I'm proud of. When it comes to identity and especially work around farm workers and aceros and the history that comes with, how did you embrace all of that, and how do you especially talking about the farm worker aspect of it, how do you talk about that with the pride that you do?
Well, it wasn't always like that. As a kid, I remember being 12 years old and everybody coming back from spring break, and they would look at me and they say, "Norma, you look so tan. Like, were you at the beach? Were you at the park?" And I was like, "No, I was out in the field." And so then if my tan didn't give me away, absolutely the smell off of my hands, because when you're working picking onions, that smell on your hands does not wash off. And there's nothing a 12-year-old does not want to smell like more than onions. There I was having to go into the classroom and feeling like I was very different than the other kids and being embarrassed, because then I would have to also go to my teacher and say, you know, I'm having a lot of trouble holding a pencil because of those scissors that I would use were for adults. And those scissors would leave my hands cramped and bruised and sore. And it was really difficult for me to be able to keep up with my studies. And so I would have to talk to the teachers about extensions or helping me out, and to be understanding that that was, you know, that I needed certain accommodations. And so I didn't always feel that great sense of pride, but it wasn't until as I got older and I started to see more teachers that looked like me, that talked to me about who I was and my history, encouraging me to be able to research more about it and to be able to do research projects around it. That's what really sparked that interest and that excitement about discovering who I was. And I remember in high school, I was asked to do a justice project about something, an injustice in the United States. And so automatically my brain went to farm workers who are excluded from so many of the labor protections that many people enjoy. They do not get the right to be able to unionize, no overprotection or overtime pay or other benefits that many people get to enjoy. Farm workers are left out of a lot of those. Even today with the COVID relief packages, so many farm workers are undocumented and they were left out of much needed relief out in their communities. And so we continue to see that throughout history. And I knew that, and I learned about so much of these pieces because in the classroom, I was encouraged to be able to explore a little bit more about who I was. And so it was, as I went on to college, I'm also a graduate of the University of Texas Pan American in the Rio Grande Valley. And so when I was in there, I got to learn a little bit more about the culture and who we are and how we are actually connected to the earth. That's something that our ancestors did back in the indigenous, you know, communities, how they had such a talent and a knowledge for being a part of the earth. And today, you know, growing up as a farm worker, I might have not been so excited to work in the fields because of the kind of conditions that I had to labor under, the hard conditions, the low pay, the insults, the being sprayed with pesticides and other chemicals. But if you talk to farm workers, they have a pride in the work that they do, that they provide an essential service to our communities. They love being able to harvest those fruits and vegetables. They take a pride in knowing that with their hands, they're feeding America. And so, you know, the difference is they want to be able to do their work with dignity, with respect, being able to be compensated fairly for the work that they're doing. And it's not that it's terrible. And with me, as I started to learn about some of these indigenous roots of the cultivation of the fruits and vegetables, I started to fall back in love with being outside, with handling the earth, with being able to garden the way my grandparents did, and carrying all of that knowledge that they were able to pass on to our families about being close, about being able to work hard, about being able to be connected to the earth and grow our own vegetables, grow our beautiful plants. That I have wonderful memories of the rose bushes that my mom would grow and the other flowers that my grandmother had such a green thumb. But those were all things that I had to relearn how to be able to embrace, and how they're a part of my community, and that they're not this terrible version that was tied to these abusive conditions that I had to work under, but instead that I could be able to find the pride in knowing that the Aztecs, that knowing that the Mayans, that the Incas, that all of these people had developed this wonderful technology on how to be able to cultivate the ground, how here in the US, there's so many indigenous communities that have always harvested our fruits and vegetables and can do it with so much pride and while taking care of the earth. And so there's a better way. And so to me, the more I got to learn when I went on to get my master's degree, and I got to dig in deeper and learn more when I got to go now work here in Washington, D.C. and learn from other wonderful community leaders and hear their experiences, it really did build up that sense of pride of my heritage, of who I am, and being able to look at the work that me and my parents did out in the fields to feed America, look at it through a different lens and with a lot more sense of pride.
I mean, I'm getting emotional. That was better put than I could have ever imagined. And with so much, every sentence was just relatable if like your families come from that, and it is. I mean, that filled me with just tons of pride. And so thank you for sharing that. That was very beautiful. Dr. Saenz, what are your thoughts on Hispanic heritage, and how do you celebrate and how do you honor those your ancestors?
Yeah, I think that it's again, as Norma mentioned, the opportunity that the contributions that we make in the community have been highlighted, and the celebrations that take place. Today, the Washington Post had a very beautiful feature on the Latino Hispanic population, and it was on the online. It says "Somos Latino, Somos Latina, Somos Hispanic, Somos Latinx," and so forth. It had all these terms, and one of the nice features of the article is that it really highlighted the great diversity that exists within the Latino community. So that the Afro-Latinos, for example, the immigrant population, those that have been here for a long time, the diversity that exists in sexuality and so forth. So it was a very wonderful feature. And that I think, and I really enjoy also in participating in these kinds of events as well, because it allows us to tell our stories. Oftentimes, we know that at the K through 12 system, especially in a place like here in Texas, that we always have to fight to get our history told and so forth, and efforts to try to keep students from learning about Dolores Huerta, for example, or Cesar Chavez. That fight is still going on, and the importance, and as Norma mentioned, the great contributions that Latinos have made, all the way from agriculture, all the way to art, to music, to the academy and so forth. There's so much contributions, and the ability to be able to get that message out. Yeah.
And here in Arizona, we can outdo all the things I think that have existed in the history, unfortunately, and it's a similar fight, similar struggle as well as it is in Texas, and in so many respects, that fight is there's a lot of hopelessness that's associated to it, with the population here in Arizona being continue to be not supported, especially in the education system. So in terms of your advice, and so we're nearing the end of this conversation, and I kind of just want to, if your final thoughts on identity, embracing identity, and honoring those in our community. And so anybody who, this is just to wrap it up, anybody who would like to speak.
I can start. So as I mentioned, I take a lot of pride in the work that I get to do with Justice for Migrant Women. And I love the fact that we have a few campaigns that celebrate the stories of those folks that are part of our communities that are oftentimes forgotten, especially those that are harvesting our fruits and vegetables. We have the Phenomenal Farm Worker campaign, which shares real life stories of farm workers from across our country. Whether it's our parents that we're celebrating, people like me who grew up in these struggles, because I think it's important to be able to share that pride, and to be able to see how phenomenal farm workers really are. And along with that, as a project of our CEO and founder, Monica Ramirez, as part of the Butterfly Lab and Race Forward, she also started a campaign, The Humans Who Feed Us, of being able to see beyond just the hands, but understanding that these people that are out there as part of the food supply chain that feeds all of America, they're entire people. And through this campaign, she's humanizing folks to make sure that people can see the totality, who they are. It's really hard to other folks and to be able to demonize them when you could see that they are real people, a part of our community. So I invite folks to be able to check that out at Justice for Migrant Women, my organization. And on a personal note, I would also invite people to be able to bring their full selves everywhere that they go, whether it's the work that they're doing, whether it's at their homes, whether it's in their communities, bring their full selves. Because again, I'm a big believer that representation matters, and those powerful stories are not being told because people do not feel that sense of pride. And our kids are watching. I have a daughter who's seen how I carry myself and what I feel pride in and what are the things about myself that I hide. And so I want her to know that being a Latina, being a powerful woman, being a Hispanic, being an American, being all of these things are wonderful things that can be great unifiers in our community, and they all deserve to be celebrated. And so I will continue to wave that flag proudly everywhere that I go, and to be able to show people that you can be all of these things. You don't have to slice up who you are, and you can feel a great sense of pride in all of the wonderful contributions about who we are, because that is what our ancestors dreamed of, that we could be able to be those people today. And so those are just my last final thoughts for people, to really encourage them. And I will say, for those educators, encourage those kids too. They made such a difference with me. So much of my journey and self-discovery was inside the classroom, and it really helped to be able to have teachers that could see that and would encourage me to be curious, to ask questions, and to be able to see me as more than just another student, another problem, another headache, because of all the paperwork that came with me being a farm worker kid and a migrant kid that was behind on classrooms. It was with those teachers that saw me as a talented writer, as a great speaker, that really helped me believe in who I was, and who I am today now.
Thank you so much, Norma. Dr. Saenz, same question.
Yeah, so I think that one of the major kind of messages is, again, taking pride in that, in the roots that we have, the roots that come from Mexico, from other parts of Latin America and the Caribbean, and having that sense as well of trying to find that passion, whatever it is, a passion that you're going to find, because once you get that passion, and especially if it's rooted within our particular community, telling our own story, telling our stories of our communities, the way we've been demonized in certain respects, as we've seen the last several years, and correcting that. And I think that that is that passion, when you find the work that you want to do, and the passion, and telling the story, and making challenging to make challenging the mainstream, or the way things are, in order to make sure that we are part of that larger fabric of the U.S. is extremely important. And I think in that I see, looking back, for example, from the time that I grew up in the Valley, and finding that passion for writing, for doing data analysis and so forth. And I really have seen, from the time that the COVID came along, when I was trying to initially gather information on what was going on in the Latino community, because there was so little information, and trying to get that word out. And I think that when you have that passion for the work that you do, in many respects, the kind of work that we do, it's really pleasurable. It's not that I have to wake up in the morning and it's going to be like I'm going to go teach, or I'm going to go write, and things like that. And I'm really impressed and very proud of the younger generation, people like in your generation, both of you, that are doing really tremendous things and really pushing the boundaries and achievements that are going on. And I'm really excited with the younger generation, with those role models that they're seeing, and where we will become. We're talking about 62 million people. In Texas, we're going to be the largest group later on this year, or in 2022, and all those opportunities that come as we're growing in numbers, as we're achieving greater things and so forth, and meeting challenges, overcoming them, and so forth. Yes.
So before I let you go, I did want to ask a question from the audience that I'm reading here. I'm gonna try to summarize it a little bit, but either one of you if any of you would like to answer it, please feel free. And this is a consideration of the term color relates to people of color, and if it otherizes us, if we continue to other each other by calling ourselves or calling members of the community people of color. The term quote color marginalize our diverse races, ethnicities, experiences, and perspectives. And if the term perhaps makes certain people feel invisible, just quote the word color, like as a person of color.
I mean, my initial thoughts on that is that, absolutely right, that race is a social construct. All of these labels have been things that have been added to us, not things that we necessarily pick for ourselves, but there are common struggles. It would be irresponsible for us to pretend that there aren't systems of oppression that are seeing us as people of color, and that the white community has certain advantages over folks like us. And I think that in saying people of color, rather than to try to erase people, as I mentioned, I'm a fan of checking as many boxes as possible, but to understand that there is a shared experience. I spoke about farm workers and my experiences, but before farm workers were out there harvesting the land, it was Black communities that were slaves that were out there harvesting those lands, people that were there against their choice. And so there is that shared experience. And even now, if you look at the numbers of the rates of dropouts, child mortalities, of the health disparities, of the poverty rates, all of those pieces of those who are in our jails, you continue to see those people that are at the bottom are those that are brown and Black, and not because that's where we choose to be, but because those are the systems where they're sending us. So I'll just leave it at that, of saying I see it as a unifier, as a way of being able to celebrate who we are, and that we're overcoming a whole lot of barriers that were set up before us. And it's when we band together, when we realize that not until all of us are free, none of us are free, that we will never be able to fulfill our promises.
Yeah. And with that shared experiences and so forth, you also have the great opportunity for solidarity, the building of bridges across the different groups, Latinos, African Americans, Native Americans, and all of those have been tremendously hard hit by the pandemic. We've seen that disproportionate people dying and losing their lives during the pandemic as well.
For sure. And so last question, and this is, as we wrap things up, this is a tradition here at Sepas, asking this question, which I will read. Hypothetical, imagine that All in Education is updating the infamous Loteria card, or Mexican bingo, if you will, the card icons, and has asked you to submit a suggestion for consideration. Who or what cultural icon would you suggest and why? So it can be thought, feeling, thing, food item. I've heard the gamut at this point, but what comes to mind for you both?
For me, La Chingona Mera Mera would be Dolores Huerta. She is my hero. She's an amazing woman. I've had the opportunity to get to know her personally, and she is a spitfire. She is a great leader, loves to dance, loves to eat, loves to be just a wonderful people, just a beautiful person inside and out, and somebody I absolutely admire. And I think she needs to be celebrated every chance we can. Living
sure. No, love it. What about you, Dr. Saenz?
Let's see. I'm going to go with el migrante, that is the person that has made this country as rich as it is, the person that has been the farm worker, the person that has been right now in terms of the meat packing industry and so forth. And this is really the spirit of this country. And for us as a community, that has been our roots in here in the United States and in the Americas.
I love it both. Thank you again, both of you, for being here today. Thank you for taking the time to just teach and your commitment, your sacrifices that you made. They are certainly helping people like me be more comfortable in the skin that I'm in and able to share that with the next generation. So your longstanding commitment is I'm filled with pride after this conversation. So thank you both for all of that.
Thank you for having us. It was a pleasure.
Of course. Thanks for everybody watching. This has been another podcast Sepas. I hope everybody has a good week. Goodbye.
Okay.